Okay, I think we can kick off this discussion. So before we start, I'm going to give you a little introduction to this program, and then I will introduce Professor Logevall, if I pronounce it correctly. And then, of course, we'll start our real discussion. So first of all, I want to welcome everyone that just connected to this Zoom. Just to inform you as well, we're going to have some time for questions at the end of this session. So please, while we are doing our discussion, put your questions in the chat box that is, of course, below in your screen. So you can ask these questions, and at the end, I will make sure most of them will be answered for you. So welcome first to this French-American Histories, One Story, Two Narratives, which is a captivating program of virtual talks which are presented by the French Embassy in Washington, D.C., but also Villa Albertine and the Fédération des Alliances Françaises in the USA. So I'm your host, I'm Iris de Rode, and our program will discuss the vibrant French-American relations through a lot of conversations with leading scholars, experts, but also practitioners in the field of French-American relations today. And so today's episode is titled Decolonizing Perspectives, France and the United States in the Era of Decolonization. It explores, of course, the complex relationship that unfolded during this pivotal period in world history. As France grappled with relinquishing its colonial holdings, including Vietnam and Algeria, tensions and collaborations emerged between France and the United States. The United States, of course, was mainly advocating for self-determination and national liberation, and it navigated its own strategic and economic interests in a global landscape. So we will delve into the nuances of this era, especially examining the blend of cooperation, the tension, and particularly, of course, diverse interests between France and the United States. But of course, despite all these challenges, both nations also maintained a significant cooperation in areas such as economic aid, but also military collaboration and diplomatic negotiations. And so for this discussion, we are privileged today to have with us a distinguished guest, Professor Fredrik Logevall, who is professor at Harvard University. He is both professor of international affairs, but also professor of history. So Logevall is a renowned expert, of course, in US foreign relationships, history, but also modern international history. He is a native of Stockholm in Sweden, and he holds a PhD in history from Yale University. With a rich academic background, Logevall has authored or edited 10 books, including his latest work, JFK, Coming of Age in the American Century, from 1917 to 1956. Notably, his book, Embers of War, The Fall of an Empire and the Making of America's Vietnam of 2012, received the Pulitzer Prize in 2013. Pulitzer Prize for History, that is. He also has published another book in collaboration with Campbell Gregg called America's Cold War, The Politics of Insecurity. So I only named these books that are, of course, part of the larger corpus of all his publications, but these are the ones that are really relevant for this discussion we'll have today, of course, including decolonization and particularly also the Cold War era, of which, of course, Logevall is a preeminent scholar. And so during our conversation now, we will unravel the complexities of the post-colonial transitions, global power dynamics, and the delicate balance between national interest and the ideals of self-determinations. So without further ado, let's embark on this fascinating journey all together. I will have some slides for you, but I wanted to do this presentation first so that you actually could see us, because otherwise we'll disappear and become smaller, of course. So I will share some slides, as I just said, because I want to also show you some of the maps, for instance, or photos of the relevant parts of the discussions that we're going to have. And again, if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and then we'll come back to them at the end of this session. So here are some of the books that I have mentioned: JFK, America's Cold War, Embers of War, and also Choosing, that I have not mentioned, but that's also about Vietnam. So it's quite clear here that we have a real experts of all the topics. So Before we start talking about all the details, I would like to refresh, of course, some of the memories of people. So we'll talk about decolonization and its context. But before, um, I would like to ask you, since you have such a profound expertise in the US history and international history during this crucial period of decolonization and Cold War, coming from Sweden, what sparked your interest in delving into this particular phase of American history?
Well, first off, I'm just delighted to be with you, and I thank you for having me on. And I love the French pronunciation of the surname. Typically I'm Logevall, so with a hard G. But I think, Iris, for the purpose of today's seminar, Logevall is a much better. We'll go with the French pronunciation today, and of course, you can just call me Fredrik or Fred for our purposes. Also, I noticed that in the Q&A, somebody is saying that the chat is disabled. So I don't know if that's something, Iris, you need to deal with. They want to pose a question. You can probably see that too.
Yeah, I think it's because there's two different options to the chat.
Oh, I see.
And
They
so
should
there
leave
will
it in the
be,
chat. Yeah.
yeah, if you could do if it doesn't work, the other chat will.
Okay.
So, yeah, thank
Excellent.
you.
So I think when you live in a small country, in my case, Sweden, and you're interested in the world, as I was as a boy, you automatically become interested in the United States. It was the big superpower. And so you take an interest in the US, and I think that was the case with me in Sweden. Later in high school, when we had emigrated to Vancouver, Canada, I think this continued, this built up. My father had a subscription to Time magazine, and I remember every week just devouring that magazine, which, of course, this is now late 70s, early 80s, a time of great American power on the world stage. I think all of this honed this interest. And there was one other thing that happened, which is one day I happened upon the great BBC documentary that you know, The World at War. And it just blew my mind. The archival footage, the narration by Sir Laurence Olivier, which was so calm and dignified. It had this elevated and tone, if I can put it that way. And I remember thinking that this is just something that I want to explore further. I think I need to become, in some way or another, a historian. That show just had this enormous effect on me. I don't think I realized fully until later. I can still remember, Iris, the first lines from the first episode, which are set in France. It's a village near Limoges, and Olivier begins something like this: "Down this road, on a summer day in 1944, the soldiers came. Nobody lives here now. They only stayed a few hours. When they left, this community, which had lived for 1,000 years, was dead." And I think it built from there. And then in university, I became interested in Vietnam. I read that mesmerizing book, David Halberstam, The Best and the Brightest, about America's descent into the war after the French. It's especially Kennedy and Johnson that he's concerned with. It's sprawling, completely gripping account, in my view. I don't agree with all aspects of it now, but as a university student, it was just spellbinding. And I think, again, more clear in hindsight than at the time, that set me on a path, A, to pursue graduate studies, and B, to delve into the Cold War, and in particular, I guess, first the American war in Vietnam, and then in subsequent works, also looking at the French War.
Thank you so much. That was very interesting, and especially the influence of film on your decisions and your whole path in your career. We've had a previous episode on the power, or the soft power, let's call it, of film and culture. So I think that's an interesting inspiration that you have. And so before we really talk more about the context of the different aspects of French-American relations during this period, could you maybe provide some context to us? So being, of course, the broader context. Just to refresh our memories, I'm sure everyone has had this a long time ago, probably at school. Some others might know already, of course, but can you provide a brief overview of when decolonization occurred, the countries and regions involved, and particularly how France reacted to this global shift? And then
Yeah.
in parallel, also what prompted US's involvement in the decolonization process. So really about decolonization and France and the US, and maybe a little piece of information too on the leaders involved. So it's a large question, but I hope.
Yeah, no, of course. And please, if I leave something out, just follow up. I mean, because it is a big question, big topic. Um, I mean, I think it's helpful. I say this to my own students, that it's really the undoing of colonialism. And that's what we're talking about. Somehow, at least it helps me to think of it in those terms, decolonization, the undoing of colonialism. The heart of the period, if you will, I would say is 1945 to 1960. In those 15 years, some 36 countries, it's kind of amazing, become independent. Um, um, in many cases, outright independence. In other cases, they achieve autonomy from their European colonial powers, rulers. And that, of course, includes the French, which is a particular interest to us. The French Empire is large. It's second only to the British. In, say, 1939, we're talking about something like 6 million square miles, 80 million overseas overseas people in the French Empire. So this is no small thing, either for the French, for the British, Portuguese, and others. I think the other thing that's worth saying here is that the process of decolonization, there was no single process by which this decolonization occurred. And what I mean by that is some places it was peaceful and orderly. In other places it was violent, and it was revolution. And in some cases, I think European powers were prepared to work with these new entities. In other cases, they resisted. And in some cases, you see the governments that took power after independence. They were immediately stable and functioning. Others, in other cases, it quickly descended into civil war. But it's an absolutely amazing phenomenon in these 15 years. And what's interesting about it, among other things, is that far-sighted people, Iris, in the colonial powers had an inkling that this was coming in the interwar period. It's not that difficult to find officials at the mid-level, in some cases even at higher levels, who could see the writing on the wall, could see that this was happening. The other thing I suppose we should say here is that the US itself was a colonial power, even if Americans often wanted to deny the fact, even if Americans for decades really liked to practice a kind of informal imperialism. So not outright annexation as informal imperialism, but informal. Economic penetration, political subversion, the threat of intervention. That's often how Americans went about this business. And I'll say one other thing with respect to France, which I find so interesting. And when I worked on Embers of War, this was an important finding for me. I wasn't the first to find it by any means, but it was important to me. And that is, my sense, Iris, is that across the political spectrum in 1944, 45, French officials there was a consensus that a restoration of the empire was needed for France to restore French grandeur, restore France's place on the international stage, keep France as a member of the political club. I think people felt this on the left and the right. Certainly de Gaulle felt this. And then finally, that process of decolonization and how to respond to the forces of anti-colonialism, I think, preoccupied all of the governments who made up the Fourth Republic. So from 46 until de Gaulle's return in 58, to a greater or lesser degree, depending on the period, this is a kind of obsessive interest. And of course, that includes North Africa. It includes Indochina, which maybe we'll talk about here. But a kind of consensus, at least in the early period, that the empire is necessary and should be preserved.
Thank you. And so you said that, of course, that's the whole idea of restoring the grandeur, not letting it fade away, let France fade away. And they, of course, did a lot for that. So they waged wars to prevent that from happening. And so you discuss, too, in your book, America's Cold War. So obviously on the Cold War, the dominant role the United States played, of course, on the world stage, in particular after the Second World War, of course. So can you elaborate on the ways in which dynamics of this Cold War influenced the process of decolonization? So this is more, again, a broader context question. And why was the US that involved in all this if you said that they didn't really have an empire, even if in a sort of a more informal way they did? Why were they so concerned by all these questions?
That's a really good question. And I think the key here is, of course, that these things are happening simultaneously. So the Cold War breaks out, depending on, where you come down on this question, in 46 or maybe 47. Certainly in the latter part of the 1940s, we have the existence of a Cold War, precisely as this process of decolonization is really reaching maturation, or at least is becoming much more present. And I think that for leaders in Washington and in Moscow, and in other capitals of, let's say, East and West, but in particular in the two superpowers, I think leaders come to see this struggle, this East-West struggle, as a zero-sum game, meaning a gain for one side is automatically a corresponding loss for the other side. So it's a zero-sum game. What that I think means, among other things, is that whereas the Cold War could begin as a struggle over the future of Central Europe, Eastern Europe, the Near East, pretty soon, it's actually a global struggle. Every part of the world is somehow now in play, which means that decolonization becomes wrapped up, it seems to me, in this decolonization struggle and the reverse. And I think with respect to Franco-American relations between Paris and Washington, it's pretty interesting. This is a theme in Embers, but I don't think it applies just to Indochina. The French, and I think this is maybe true also to some extent of other European colonial powers, but the French, maybe in particular, proved pretty skillful, I would say, in the early years, 46, 47, 48, 49, 50, in arguing to American leaders, listen, if you want our help in Western Europe, and if you want us to work hard to make sure that Central Europe stays non-communist, and that in France itself, the communists don't take power, fine, we will do that. But in return, we want your help in restoring French control in various parts of the empire. They even are pretty clever about articulating an early version of the domino theory. This is true also of the British. But the French basically, excuse me, they say to the Americans, look, if one part of the empire falls to communism, and we know that Ho Chi Minh, for example, is a dedicated communist, if one part of it falls, we can't guarantee that other parts don't fall. It may have a kind of global impact, or at least a regional impact. And that's a message that I think gets through. The other thing we should note here, Iris, I think in this whole discussion, which we sometimes lose sight of, is just how colossal the United States was in this period. It's in a sense, obviously, a two superpower world. In a different sense, maybe not, in the sense that, as Stalin knew all too well, the Americans had power that he could only dream of. So, 28% of global GDP in 1945, the US has. It has bases, military installations, all of a sudden, really, all over the world. It's in lone possession of the atomic bomb until the Soviets get theirs in 1949. It's just, I guess my thought is it's useful to remind ourselves, especially now in a time when American power is in relative, to say the least, relative decline, to think back on this period after the war when the US looms so large.
Thank you. That's very clear to have that basics for us to understand, and especially have the context on indeed how important the US was and how they could shape the entire global conditions, of course. And so you already referred to Embers of War, your book, and that's where you're really delving, well, in many different things, but in particular, of course, the Vietnam War, which is probably the war everyone would think of course, if you think about decolonization and then the French-American relations. So can you elaborate on particularly the considerations for the US, in particular to Vietnam? And of course, Vietnam was part of the French colony of Indochina. So it's just one of the countries that are part of the larger Indochina.
Yeah.
And so, how did the principles of the United States in particular then influence, of course, the French-American relations? And how did that whole war just sort of explode in all these different ways?
Well, I mean, it's a topic, even though I've written this big, long book, Embers, that you mentioned, Embers of War, it's just endlessly fascinating. I feel like I could sit down and, write another book on this, because I just think it's both historically important and utterly fascinating. And the later period in the war, which is to say, let's call it the American War, has been the subject of a huge amount of scholarly attention. I think a lot less on the period that we're talking about here and that you're asking about here. I'll say a few things, and you can then, we can elaborate or we can go further. I think that for the United States, the transition between Franklin Roosevelt, who died in April 1945, just as World War II is drawing to a close, the transition between him and Harry Truman, his successor, on the topic of European colonialism, and maybe in particular the French variant, I think matters a lot. For reasons that I lay out in the book, I think Roosevelt had a visceral, a deep aversion to allowing the French to come back into Indochina. He softened a little bit on this in the final months of his life, but I don't think that much. So, one of the things I do with my students is I pose counterfactual questions, or we address them in a careful way. If FDR lives, and he died a young man, I think he was 63, if I remember correctly. He could easily have lived longer, even with his health problems. What would it have meant for Indochina? Because he had this aversion, this opposition to the French returning that Harry Truman did not have. It's not that Harry Truman was pro-imperialism or pro-colonialism. He just didn't have that deep opposition to this. So I think that matters. It also matters that there's a split in the State Department between those who want to support the French in their desire to return to Indochina, or at least not stand in the way. We've got bigger fish to fry. We need the French. We need French support in Europe. Therefore, let's let them do this in Indochina. That's one group, the Europeanists in the State Department, and the Asianists, who feel very strongly the other way, that in fact Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the emerging Vietnamese revolution, is the person that the United States should support. Or if they don't go that far, they at least don't want to do anything that even indirectly helps the French. So that tussle, that disagreement in the US government, I think is important. I also want to mention maybe I'll stop and we can pursue other aspects of this, including the French War and then Dien Bien Phu and so forth. But I just want to mention that domestic politics in the United States and the politics of anti-communism. There's something called the Second Red Scare that also erupts in the late 1940s. And that, I think, overlays everything we're discussing. Politicians become very fearful of being perceived as soft or being called soft on communism. And I think that matters to Truman at key points in this story. I think it matters to other officials in the American government, obviously congressional figures. It shapes this emerging belief, little by little this happens, that the United States needs to back France, defeat the communists in Indochina, and strengthen thereby the Western alliance. And there's this early thinking that I alluded to earlier, early domino theory kind of articulations, that if Indochina falls, or even if Tonkin in the north should fall, that'll be a disaster. And the French, again, are pretty good at suggesting as much, playing up that dimension for the Americans.
Yeah, so that would automatically lead, of course, to that awful defeat that the French are facing, as you just mentioned. Then I always have a problem pronouncing just like your name, but then which here you can see on the screen is a moment where the French have, well, maybe you can explain what we see here better than me, but that's that very famous battle, of course, that we probably all have heard of. So how did that French defeat, of course, shape American involvement even more? And then what role did all these diplomatic maneuvering play that then led the United States to really follow war and join the war effort?
Yeah, this is an extraordinary image that you have for us on the screen. It's almost certainly staged after the fact. Nevertheless, I think it captures so much of what is happening in 1954. And then the little map that you also have for us shows where Dien Bien Phu is located, which I visited in the course of writing Embers of War. It's an extraordinary place. I think we write better history when we visit the places that we're writing about. And I felt certainly after visiting Dien Bien Phu, I had a better sense of what the French experienced. And we don't have time to go into the actual battle here. Suffice it to say that it's one of the great, in my view, military defeats of the 20th century that the French suffered in this place. But a couple of things worth noting. The Americans were anxious to prevent a French defeat. They wanted to save the French position. I suggest in Embers of War that by even 1952-53, the Americans were more committed to the French war in Indochina than were the French themselves, which is a provocative assertion, but I think it's correct. So the Americans want to prevent this defeat that suddenly seems to be looming. And the Americans consider various plans. One of them is called Operation Vulture, which is to try to save the French position. It includes a nuclear dimension, the potential use of tactical nuclear weapons. The French get wind of this and they say, please, no, because you're going to kill a lot of communists, but you're also going to kill the entire French garrison. And the British feel the same. And so, of course, it doesn't happen. But my point is, the Americans are looking for ways to try to save the French. I think the other thing that's worth saying here is about this moment in 54, very key transition, is with the French defeat. Symbolically, we can say at Dien Bien Phu, but more generally over the months, I guess, that we could say that follow. I think American officials, Dwight Eisenhower, John Foster Dulles, Vice President Nixon, excuse me, I have an allergy that's causing a cough. Some part of them, I think, is actually relieved Okay, we've got the French out of the way. Now we can try to create in the southern part of the country a non-communist bastion. We're going to be free of the taint of colonialism because we're not like the French. What I also then suggest, and I'll be brief about this because as you can tell, I can talk too long about this. But what I also suggest in Embers is the degree to which to study these two wars in succession, that is to say the French War and then later the American War, is to experience a feeling of déjà vu. So for example, the soldierly complaints about, not being able to distinguish friend from foe, the poor fighting spirit among our indigenous troops as opposed to theirs, the meddling politicians back home, the constant proclamations that victory is around the corner, all of these refrains, that we have to avoid premature negotiations because that would dishonor the soldiers who have already fallen. It goes on and on. That the United States, I guess my point is the United States would experience so many of the same frustrations from their perspective in trying to thwart the Vietnamese communists under Ho Chi Minh and later Le Duan and other leaders. They would experience so many of the same things that the French experienced. And yet, for so long, as I suggest in the book, American officials were unwilling to concede that they might be walking, as Bernard Fall put it, walking in the same footsteps as the French, even if they were dreaming different dreams. It's an extraordinary, in my view, story of one Western power following another Western power and suffering, broadly speaking, a very similar outcome.
Yes, and can you explain what did the French do afterwards? Did they retreat? Did they give what happened there?
Yeah, so the French. There's a Geneva conference that's actually begun before Dien Bien Phu is settled, but that Geneva conference divides Vietnam in two. And I think you sent me the slides earlier. There may be a slide that shows that division at the 17th parallel. So we now have a North Vietnam and a South Vietnam, and Ho Chi Minh and the DRV government is in charge in the North, and in the South you have a non-communist government. Bit by bit, somewhat complicated process, but bit by bit, the French withdraw from Indochina. Doesn't happen right away, and in economic terms and in cultural terms, the presence lingers. Well, arguably to this day, you can get, for example, superb French coffee, on the streets of Hanoi today. But in economic terms, cultural terms, the French remain longer. But in political terms, within, depending on how you define it, 18 months, 2 years, they're out. In practical terms, I think much before that. I do think it's fair to say that the French colonial experiment effectively dies in 1954.
All right, that's very clear. So then, of course, talking about France and the United States, you will all think, hopefully, to the two presidents that are so involved in all this. Of course, being Eisenhower and Charles de Gaulle, and their relationship is also an interesting one to discuss.
Yeah.
We've had one of the episodes about that too. Here we can see them that discuss their relationship more in detail. But I think it is a very important one, of course, to talk about them during this Vietnam War. And so how did the strategic interest and mainly diplomatic interaction between these two men that, of course, knew each other already from the Second World War, how did that have an influence on that region and the unfolding events of the war? And especially, of course, when France was still trying to maintain colonial presence. But then, of course, when the United States, what you just described, that process. So my question is mainly about their relationship and what that meant for the conflict.
Yeah, it's an interesting one that they had. And as you rightly point out, it really begins in World War II. Eisenhower as Supreme Allied Commander, de Gaulle as leader of the Free French. He was a difficult ally, I think it's fair to say. In the Second World War, he was at least from an American perspective, and I think a British one, hypersensitive, to planning and communications about strategic matters that somehow excluded him. And he was excluded from the planning of the D-Day invasion, and that didn't help. So then, if we go to 53, Eisenhower becomes president, and de Gaulle is out of power, but he's hovering in the background. Eisenhower becomes president, and then Eisenhower returns to power in 1958. And by this point, again, the French, they're very much involved in Algeria, which we could discuss. And by and large, the Eisenhower administration supports, or at least is not willing to oppose, what the French are doing in trying to save their position in Algeria. John F. Kennedy, who we may discuss, and who I'm writing about now in this biography, feels differently. And both the French and Dwight Eisenhower, the Eisenhower administration, are upset with Kennedy for suggesting in 1957 that the French are on the wrong path in Algeria and serious thought should be given to independence and so on. We can come back to that. But I think the relationship between these two men is, I don't think they're particularly close. I don't think they see each other, unless I'm mistaken about this. I don't think they see each other between the end of the war and the late 1950s, maybe in 59, when Eisenhower visits Paris. There certainly aren't many meetings. But the other thing I think worth saying about them, which is why I find their relationship interesting, is that we're talking about two soldiers, soldier to soldier. And I think that Eisenhower, almost in spite of himself, Iris, admires de Gaulle and admires his astonishing, what should we say, self-belief, his astonishing self-confidence, his kind of unshakable, unswerving belief that he represents France and is committed to the restoration of French prestige. I think some part of Eisenhower, and this was true, by the way, of other American officials, they were frustrated by de Gaulle, no end, but some part of them still had to kind of admit a grudging admiration for the man.
Yeah, and since you talked about Algeria, can you explain briefly what the situation was there and how the involvement of French for the War of Algeria? It's also a very famous one, but a little bit more background to that.
No, we could talk about this at length. What's one of the interesting things about it is that immediately, within months, or we could even say weeks, of the French defeat in Indochina, they shift and now have to face not the same struggle, but certainly in broad terms a similar kind of struggle in Algeria. And that experience of fighting revolutionaries in Indochina certainly helps the French. I think there's more work that could be done on comparing the two wars at the military, at the strategic and tactical level. It'd be interesting to do more exploring there. But certainly the French have learned some lessons. But what happens, to cut a fascinating story short, is that the French begin this struggle that's going to last about 7 or 8 years. And militarily, I think it's fair to say that the French do well for long stretches, like the Americans in Vietnam and like the French in Vietnam. They win more battles than they lose, but politically, it becomes increasingly difficult for the French to sustain the effort in Algeria. Kennedy comes along at an interesting moment and basically sees this. I'm writing about this in my second volume. And now he's a senator. He sees this. The Eisenhower administration does not, or at least is not willing to admit it. De Gaulle, after he returns to power in 58, little by little begins to see that you need to have a political solution. And that you can't sustain this. Ultimately, Algeria achieves independence. That's a quick summation.
Yeah, but it's all happening at the same time, so it's relevant for the whole discussion, and particularly talking about JFK. Of course, your writing the second volume right now of the first volume is already published, if I understand correctly. The second one, of course, being more about the later years. But so going back to Vietnam and John F. Kennedy's quite famous, I would say, role in it, of course, he faced significant challenges, of course, and also the popular support was not at his side during the Vietnam War anymore. But so if you talk about his involvement in Vietnam and considering factors like the increasing US military presence, but also strategic considerations of the entire Cold War, and especially his evolution there of his approach to the war. And then also, can we talk a little bit about, of course, him and de Gaulle, who is still there here standing on the photo in between JFK and, of course, his wife.
No, you've got that photograph with Jackie there. There's a famous visit by the Kennedys to Paris in May of 1961, and you're seeing the two of them here, and it's a very important visit. I'll just say that briefly, and then I'll go back to speak about Indochina. Very interesting that Kennedy is on his way to meet Khrushchev in Vienna. Very tense time in the Cold War, and the tensions have gone up, mostly on account of Berlin. And it's worth noting, I think, that de Gaulle and Kennedy, for all their differences, they're in agreement about Berlin. And, the West has a right to be in Berlin. The West is not going to allow itself to be pushed out of Berlin. Oh, this image. So the rain has begun to fall. It's during the same visit. And these two poor guys have to stand out there in the rain. And of course they do. I recall that when Trump was in, where in France was Trump? But at some point he was when he was president a few years ago, and it was raining, and he refused to go out and be in the rain. But these two guys are there. But Kennedy in Vietnam. So, of course, as you say, in the second volume of my biography, this is going to be a very important part of the story. And I've written about it in the past. I'll just say briefly here, I don't want to take too long, but there's a paradox. And the paradox is this. Kennedy, even as a congressman, he visited Indochina in 1951 when he was a congressman. He could see through, in a very interesting way, the French expressions of optimism, because he talked to French officials in Indochina, and they all said, "Oh, we're going to win this thing. Don't worry about it. We've got it under control." Kennedy could see, even in 51, that to try to defeat the forces of anti-colonialism, in this case, in Indochina, a very dedicated adversary in Ho Chi Minh, who also had lots of support from the Chinese, who are just to the north. Kennedy said, "I don't think this is going to work." So my point is that even as a congressman, he was doubtful that you could defeat nationalist movements, anti-colonial movements, by force of arms. I don't think that skepticism ever went away. And by the way, that didn't just apply to the French, by extension also to the Americans. And yet this same Kennedy, as president, expands US involvement quite considerably in Indochina. That's the paradox. Understands the forces of anti-colonialism, gets that you need to give people around the world something to fight for, something to believe in. You can't simply go in and tell them what to do at the point of a gun. Is skeptical that you can do this. And yet this escalation occurs on his watch. And I'm grappling with this now. I think Kennedy's doubts are still there. He's skeptical about the domino theory, at least in private. Sensitive to anti-colonial aspirations. Final point. In August of 1963, late August, de Gaulle announces that there should be a political solution in Vietnam, a negotiated solution. Is Kennedy pleased by this? Is he relieved? Because after all, the French, they've been there. They know what to do. Quite the contrary. Kennedy and his advisors don't want anything to do with this. Again, speaks to this paradox. I think partly for domestic political reasons, Kennedy feels that he has to stay in Vietnam at least through the 1964 election. This raises the mother of all counterfactuals, which we can discuss, but I won't hear what he would have done, what he likely would have done had he returned from Dallas alive. It's a very large and important question, but that's a summation of Kennedy's position on Vietnam.
Interesting. I think we have to all read your second book there to find the question to the what if history question. And so we're going to go to the end of the questions a little bit, because I see there's a lot of questions from the public here. But maybe we can talk just to finalize this discussion on the French-American relations, because we've seen that they worked together, but also, of course, had quite some issues there. They had different geopolitical and ideological reactions to the same problems. So how did they still manage to maintain their relationships between all these tensions? And how would you say that of course evolved up until probably today? And how did they manage to stay partners, let's say?
Yeah, it's a large question. I think the subtext of your question is completely correct, which is that through differences, sometimes very deep differences, on Indochina, on Algeria, on NATO, on European affairs, broadly speaking, and other thorny issues, both during the Cold War and after. Terrorism, Iraq 2003. Lots of instances where we can see deep differences between Washington and Paris. Nevertheless, I would say it's been mostly a very stable relationship. Really going back, by the way, we haven't talked about the revolutionary period, which is something you know something about with your new book project. But the French were very important in the American Revolution. So there's this long, I would argue, broadly speaking, stable relationship through everything, each of them realizing how much they need the other. Again, because of America's power position, the French, I think it's fair to say, need the Americans more than the Americans need the French, but it's really both. And I think, I give Joe Biden credit for this, if we can take it up to the present moment. His efforts since he became president, following Trump, to emphasize the importance of America's alliances. That includes with respect to the French, to work in partnership with other countries, especially in a time of declining American power. He gets this, and I think it's been therefore beneficial. I would expect most French officials, if we had them with us today, would agree, even though important challenges remain with respect to Ukraine, with respect to European security, with respect to China, any number of different policy areas. And he is continuing or reaffirming after the Trump years the importance of this bilateral relationship in a way that I think really matters.
That's interesting lessons from all this. So I have a few questions from the audience now that will be in quite a random order chronologically, but let's just jump into them. I think the first question is a specific one on your book, which is if in your book you talk about the extraordinary military leadership of General Giap, about how defeated first the French, then the Americans. And so can you say a few words about that historical figure?
Yeah, I mean, I think in my view, he has to go down as General Giap has to go down as one of the great military leaders of the century, of the 20th century. Largely self-taught, studied by the way a lot of French military history. So he could speak for hours about this campaign of Napoleon's or what the French had done here, French mistakes in World War I, etc. But also other military history. He really knew his stuff. And he figured out, not alone, lots of others within the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, within the Viet Minh, as it was called, figured out the strategy for taking on a vastly superior power in the form of the French, ultimately defeating the French. I won't go into the details of the sagacity that they demonstrated. And by the way, they made their own mistakes. I don't mean to suggest they were fallible. Lots of mistakes, I think, General Zapp committed, but ultimately defeated the French. And defeated, or at least withstood, we could debate this, I would say defeated the United States, an even more powerful Western nation, using, by the way, some of the same strategic and tactical moves that had worked so well against the French. Much more to be said there, but that's a first stab. Good question.
Thank you. Another question is about the third major diplomatic initiative besides Cold War and decolonization is the development of the European Union. So how does the early idea of political union in Europe play in both decolonization and the American diplomacy in the late 50s and early 60s? So the context of the European Union's creation.
Well, I mean, the Americans, this is also a good question. The United States, in the beginning in a serious way in the Eisenhower administration, is paying very close attention to this, is helping in important ways, I think, to drive the process. We also have evidence that American officials, mid-level and high levels, have uncertainty about what they want to really happen here. How far do they want this process to go? What will be the effect on the Western alliance? What will be the effect on containing Soviet expansion and more broadly speaking, the communist world, Soviet Union and China in terms of their global ambitions? I think most officials come to see that this, especially as it begins to take shape, most officials in Washington come to see that this is going to be, what's the word, a value added. This is going to be a plus, but there's no doubt that there's a certain amount of uncertainty about this. I think the decolonization process also enters into this. I think it's important in terms of adding a sense of urgency. Depends on the countries that we're talking about. And I'm less familiar with some of the internal European dynamics and how those play out in this, say, anti-colonial struggle and that one with respect to the European Union, or what becomes the European Union. From an American perspective, as I say, it's a certain degree of uncertainty leading to a greater confidence in terms of what the outcome will mean for American national security, for America's economic security, for this international order that the United States played such a large role in creating. This, I think, U.S. officials come to see this will be a good thing for that order.
Thank you. Very, very large question indeed of all the different dynamics there.
Yeah.
There's a specific question on the Fourth Republic in France as being a very tumultuous and period, but also that the Communist Party had quite the influence during that period. So what were the effects on France's internal politics relating to communism towards French policy in Indochina?
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to speak as authoritatively to some of the domestic political machinations in the Fourth Republic. But I can paint with a broad brush and say that, yes, very tumultuous. Governments rising and falling. It has important implications. Well, I was going to say it has important implications for Indochina. Yes and no. It does, obviously, to a certain degree, but there's a great deal of continuity at the lower levels, which allows the French war effort, even with this domestic turmoil, to continue. And I think it's worth noting that several figures, maybe one figure in particular, is a kind of constant throughout the Fourth Republic. when it comes to Indochina, and that's Bidault. Georges Bidault he's sort of like a Zelig figure in the sense that he's always there, and he's committed to the Indochina enterprise, is shrewd, is capable. And as a result, you see from 46, when the Fourth Republic begins, through the end of the war in 54, by and large, French commitment to the cause. As I said earlier, I think the Americans are more committed to this thing by the end than the French were. Nevertheless, to a surprising degree, at least to me, when I started to do research on this, the kind of consensus that exists for much of this period. The communists are interesting because they, of course, begin to shift pretty dramatically. And they're a thorn in the side of other parties, but they're not able to do very much. Maybe because they're in some ways torn about what they think should happen. And of course, Ho Chi Minh is endlessly frustrated. This goes even back to the 1920s, when he helps found the French Socialist Party. He's frustrated by the fact that the French Communist Party doesn't seem to be supporting him very much. And that's another story. But that's a little bit of the Fourth Republic dynamics.
Yes, thank you. And I will end with one question that is more relating to today in France. After all these independence movements, France, of course, still maintains quite a dominant role in Africa and their former African colonies in particular. The question is, why does France continue to do that? Which is maybe a direct question, but more maybe some reflections on, yes, the period of decolonization has ended. However, France is still quite a dominant power in their former colonies.
Yeah, I mean, that's a large part of the answer to that good question. I think, and the French are not alone in this regard, by the way, but I think since we're focusing on the French here, I think French officials want to remain a member of they want their country to remain a member of the great power club, be in the rank of the first rank of powers. Or at the very least, depending on how big, if you have what your demarcations are, at the very top in sort of a second rank. If you're these days putting maybe the United States and China into a sort of separate category, but you've got to remain a member of that club, and one way you do that is by preserving, as you say, Iris, deep influence in many of the former parts of the French Empire, and wielding French influence, utilizing measures that the French have: economic, military, political, linguistic, cultural, wielding French power in every conceivable way to try to preserve that influence. I think whether they will articulate that or not, French officials, if not across the spectrum, at least across much of the spectrum, endorse that idea. That's my sense as an outsider, as an Americanist, and by specialization, but watching the French.
Interesting, thank you. So I think this will be it for today, even if there's some questions still left. But I think you have quite covered already in other points of the discussion. But so we've really covered a very broad spectrum of all these different aspects, but I think it does give us a very good and interesting idea about decolonization, the Cold War, France and the US, and all their complexities, but also their let's call it friendship that was maintained throughout this period, which is, of course, one of the things we want to address throughout this series is the moments that they were very close, moments of maybe more tensions, but also how that always kept being strong up until today in a lot of different facets. So thank you so much for today's discussion. And I'm looking forward to read your new book about the second part of the JFK biography, of course. And I'm receiving a lot of thank you for the fascinating topics. Thank you. Discussion passionnante in French. So here we go. So thank you so much for today, for tonight.
It's my pleasure to be with you, and I do have pretty good reading, and I can understand the French, so I appreciate that sentiment. It's been great to be with you. I hope we can continue the conversation at some point.
Yes, me too. Thank you so much.
All right, you take care.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Bye.